Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Maureen Conway. I'm a Vice President at the Aspen Institute, Executive Director of the Economic Opportunities Program, and I'm really thrilled to welcome you all to our conversation today. We're going to have a book talk and a conversation about Still Broke, Walmart's Remarkable Transformation and the Limits of Socially Conscious Capitalism. This conversation is part of the Economic Opportunities Program ongoing Opportunity in America discussion series, in which we explore the state of economic opportunity in the United States, the challenges workers, businesses, and communities face, and ideas for change. And today we're considering some of the ideas raised in Rick Wartzman's most recent book about the history of Walmart and some of the remarkable transformations actually in practice the company has made in recent years, and what this experience tells us about the ability of companies kind of on their own to address what I've come to call the job quality crisis in America. And just to put it simply, the job quality crisis is really kind of the issue that far too many, millions of working people in America find that working hard at a job doesn't necessarily lead to sort of basic economic security. That far too many people feel left out and left behind by the transformations in the US economy over the past several decades. That our American dream ideal, is confronting a hard reality of diminished job quality, leading to diminished optimism for the future. And this point was most recently underscored by a Wall Street Journal Newark poll some of you may have read about, which found most Americans doubt that their children will do better than they did. And many are growing very skeptical that a college degree will pay off. So for some of those of us, and I know some of you in the room and some of the folks watching online are sort of in this field of economic opportunity and economic mobility and trying to sort of foster it. The idea that most Americans say this strategy of learning, building skills, and advancing into a better job does not align with their lived reality, that should give us pause. We've been in a period of tight labor markets and companies struggling to hire, and Pew Research found that people have been quitting their jobs not only because of this issue of low pay, although that was the number one reason, but they also are quitting their jobs because their jobs don't offer them these opportunities for economic mobility. They don't offer them opportunities to learn, to build wealth, to grow, and to get ahead. And the third reason was that they don't feel respected at work. Okay, so to be honest, it's a little self-serving for me to cite this research because we recently did some work with the Families and Workers Fund, and we pulled a multi-stakeholder coalition together and all this kind of thing, trying to sort of find a common definition of a good job. And our common definition of a good job sort of is the inverse of why people are quitting their jobs, right? We found that a good job rests on basically three sort of tent poles. It provides basic economic stability, right? So people feel that they can kind of just keep their lives together, right? It provides opportunities for economic mobility, opportunities to learn, grow, to build wealth, to become more. And it provides, the jobs have equity, dignity, and voice, right? Workers feel respected for their work. People are not sort of put in roles based on race, gender, or other kinds of things, right? They're really equitable workplaces where people are respected for who they are and what they bring. And yet, we find that we find ourselves in a situation where most people say that they don't actually have a good job like that. They don't have a good job like that. So Gallup finds that less than half of Americans report that they have a good job. Some have a mediocre job, and I think it was 17% said that they had definitely a bad job. So we need to ask ourselves why work isn't working for so many, and what can be done. And that's what we're going to do today within the context of this book talk. Obviously, these are really difficult questions, and we don't have all the answers. But we're excited about having this conversation with you all, and hope we're going to be able to bring you into it too. And so here's how we're going to do it. We're gonna start with Rick kind of giving us a lightning book talk for 10 minutes. And then we're going to have our panel conversation for about 40 minutes. And then we're going to sort of be bringing you all into the conversation, and hopefully our online audience too. I want to do a quick review before we start of our technology. So for those of you joining remotely, all of our online attendees are muted. We welcome your questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can submit and upvote questions. We encourage you to share your perspective. I know we have a really knowledgeable audience, so you can share ideas, resources, and experiences related to today's topic in the chat. We always appreciate feedback. I think my colleagues may have put feedback surveys out available for people in the room, but for those of you online, it'll pop up at the end. Please do give us feedback on our event. We're always trying to do better. We're thrilled with today's participation, and thank you to those of you who submitted questions in advance. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. We also encourage you to tweet. Please use the hashtag #TalkOpportunity. If you have technical issues, please send a note in the chat or email us at eop.program@aspeninstitute.org. This event is being recorded, will be shared after the event via email. Closed captions are available. Please use the CC button at the bottom of the screen. Okay, done with that. And now I want to give a brief introduction of all of our panelists right now. They're amazing. There's more information on our website, but just briefly, Rick Wartzman is co-president at Bendable Labs, a technology consulting and research firm that aims to improve economic stability, mobility, and opportunity for people across the United States. Rick is a business journalist, I think, by trade. He had significant stints at the Wall Street Journal and LA Times. The book we were talking about is his fifth. I was corrected. I was giving him 7, but whatever. His 5th book, and in addition, he's recently added a new position as senior fellow at the Burning Glass Institute, while he continues to juggle his work as a writer and co-founder of a startup. Julie Gerke is vice president of philanthropy at Walmart, which is enough of a job in and of itself. She does not need 3 more. She leads philanthropic investments for Walmart and the Walmart Foundation and focuses on sustainability for people and planet, both in communities across the U.S. and around the globe. Julie joined Walmart in 2008. Prior to Walmart, she worked in the nonprofit community on issues of anti-racism, homelessness, and community revitalization. Byron East is the CEO and co-founder of Opportunity at Work, whose mission is to rewire the labor market so that 70+ million stars, U.S. workers who are skilled through alternative routes rather than bachelor's degrees, can work, learn, and earn to their full potential. Byron is trained as an economist. We won't hold that against him. I'm actually married to an economist. That's another story. And his work is and his work is informed by a range of previous experiences, from 20 years at McKinsey to serving as Deputy Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and Deputy Director of the National Economic Council, to lived experience growing up in Detroit and Phoenix. In the interest of full transparency, I do want to say that the Aspen Institute's Economic Opportunities Program, as well as Bendable Labs and Opportunity Work, have all benefited from Walmart's philanthropy. And I think all 3 of us here have also really enjoyed the opportunity to kind of be a learning partner and thought partner to colleagues at Walmart as they went through some of the transitions that Rick describes in his book. And I want to particularly appreciate Julie for being here today, for her willingness to engage deeply in difficult conversations. And this is the thing that I think I've really, truly come to appreciate in partnering with Walmart on all this work, is their willingness to kind of show up and talk about the hard questions and the hard issues. So thank you so much for being here today. Okay, and it is now my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Rick Wartzman to the podium to kick things off. So Rick, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Great to be with you all today. And first of all, a huge thank you to Maureen and the Aspen Institute team for putting this together. And a huge thanks as well to Byron and to Julie for being part of this. Byron, I so admire the work you've been doing on mobility. And Julie, just to echo what Maureen said, your being here, I think, speaks volumes to one of the things I really, truly admire most about Walmart. I mean, that's a real willingness to engage with your critics, and hopefully we can all get a little smarter together. So Still Broke, this was by far the fastest book I've ever written. It took about 3 years from start to finish. That's lightning speed for me. But now I've been asked to do something, as Maureen said, even more lightning speed, boil the whole thing down in about 10 minutes. So what what I thought I'd try and do is give you 5 key insights from the book. So the first thing I want to say is that Walmart is not the company it once was. For about a decade and a half, beginning in 2000, Walmart was routinely portrayed as greedy, if not downright evil, in much of the media. If you really want to scare the locals next Halloween, here's an early costume idea for you or your kids. Dress up as Walmart, 2 commentators wrote in 2008. Tellingly, this zinger didn't come from a pair of union leaders or Bernie Sanders staffers. It was served up by 2 officials from the normally staid Federal Reserve Bank. During this period, Walmart was blamed for all sorts of ills: killing off Main Street mom and pop businesses, driving U.S. manufacturing overseas, and above all, mistreating its frontline workers. I know lots of folks, yes, mostly coastal elites, who won't step into a Walmart to this day because of a reputation seared into the public's consciousness 17 or 18 years ago. But the truth is that over the years, Walmart has taken a number of steps that have helped to reform its image. It has become a much greener company, so much so that it is now seen as a corporate and environmental sustainability leader. It has given away billions of pounds of food to food banks, and it has lowered the price of prescription drugs, making essential medicines more accessible for millions of Americans. Walmart has also invested in its hourly employees as it never did before. Beginning in 2015, the company began to increase pay, improve benefits, and invest in training and education for its frontline workers. Its starting pay has gone from an average of $7.65 an hour to a minimum of $14 an hour, with the latest increase announced just a couple of months ago. The company's average hourly pay now stands at $17.50. Walmart has gone from being seen as a problem to becoming a significant part of the solution. John Struer, the chief executive of Calvert Research and Management, which specializes in socially responsible investing, has said. And he is hardly alone in lavishing such praise. When Walmart began to raise its starting pay, the company landed on Fortune magazine's Change the World list. It has become, in many eyes, a paragon of socially conscious capitalism. A second insight: even with all of the progress it has made, Walmart, in my view, continues to fall short. My book acknowledges the progress that Walmart has made on many fronts, including the treatment of its frontline hourly employees. The first part of the subtitle of the book, Walmart's Remarkable Transformation, was not something that I composed casually. And yet, even with all of the positive steps it has taken, here's the bottom line. The average full-time hourly worker at Walmart still makes less than $33,000 a year. Too many of its associates are on food stamps and Medicaid. This is not to make light of the steps that Walmart has taken. In the context of its own history, the company has evolved far more than many others. Its transformation has been real. But this is also real. If you work at Walmart, even after everything the company has done to improve your job, there's more than a fair chance that you still won't make a living wage. Just because things are better doesn't mean they're good. In my view, Walmart, with free cash flow that has averaged about $17.5 billion over the past 5 years, can do more and should do more. A third takeaway: Walmart is both a source and a symbol of America's low-wage crisis. When you ask Walmart executives why the company doesn't pay more, the answer you get generally is the same. Some version of, our wages reflect the local market average for that type of job. Missing from this is any recognition that the market average has been weak for decades, and that Walmart, as the largest employer in the country, has helped to set the standard. As Allison Omens, the chief strategy officer at Just Capital, told me, it becomes a circular argument that Walmart is at the average. Functionally, they are the market. But beyond being a source of low-paying work, Walmart is also a symbol of something much bigger: a nation beset by a terrible wage crisis. A 2017 survey of thousands of frontline workers at Disneyland, which bills itself, right, it's the happiest place on earth, found that more than 10% of them had been homeless sometime in the preceding 2 years. 2/3 couldn't afford to eat 3 meals a day. 2/3 of some 10,000 Kroger supermarket workers surveyed in 2021 said they weren't earning enough to cover their basic expenses each month, with 44% reporting that they couldn't pay their rent and 39% unable to afford groceries. And on it goes, so that depending on exactly how you measure it, some 25% to 40% of the US labor force, that's 40 million to 65 million working people, have trouble making ends meet. Insight number 4. I have become convinced that Walmart and most big companies will never do enough on their own. I've always been a both-and guy, somebody who has thought that both government and business have a vital role to play in making sure that American workers can earn a decent living. But in my last book, The End of Loyalty, The Rise and Fall of Good Jobs in America, I was more of the school that government was mainly there to set the guardrails and provide a safety net when someone really needed help. It was up to business to carve up the pie broadly and fairly, as it had in the 3 decades after World War II. Washington's prod can't alone turn things around, I wrote at the time. Corporate executives must step up. It is their companies that must reinstitute a sturdier social contract with their workers. My deep dive into Walmart has caused me to reconsider. Yes, business can and should do more, but what I've come to believe is that unless there is a government mandate, Walmart and most every other company will never move far enough or fast enough to provide people with a genuine living wage. Sure, there are exceptions, such as Costco and Bank of America and PayPal and some other high-profile examples. But for most of corporate America, I'm afraid that Washington's prod will be the only way to get there. Which brings me to my final point. We need not just a minimum wage, but a government-prescribed living wage. In Still Broke, I call for a series of bold government actions to help workers regain their rightful share of the nation's prosperity. Among them, reforming labor law and devising a health system that gives every American affordable access to good medical care, untethered to the workplace. More than anything, though, we should require that companies pay their workers enough to live on. Specifically, I call for a federally mandated living wage of no less than $20 an hour. Why? Because 90% of Americans reside in a county where to support the typical working family, they need to earn at least $20 an hour, according to living wage for us. This idea of a family living wage, it should be noted, is based on widely accepted methodology used around the world and is in step with the Biden administration's push for a quote-unquote family sustaining wage. Now, I am not naive. Many are sure to dismiss $20 an hour as radical. But I would suggest that what is truly radical is this, that in the richest country on earth, 1 in 6 working people can't come up with the money for their prescription drugs. That even before COVID, about 30% of families with 2 working adults experienced material hardship, such as falling behind on the mortgage or the rent or their medical bills. That 1/3 of those going to food banks are from a household with at least one member who has been working. That nearly half of Americans have only the slimmest of financial cushions and wouldn't be able to cover their expenses for more than 2 months if they lost their job. That homelessness is not just a manifestation of mental health issues and addiction, but also of work that doesn't pay sufficiently, with more than half of those in shelters and more than 40% of those on the streets having had some formal employment in the year they were living under such conditions. When it comes to poverty, Princeton sociologist Matthew Desmond has explained, a willingness to work is not the problem, and work itself is no longer the solution. As I see it, the problem in the end isn't that companies like Walmart are evil. They're not. The problem is that this is what good in America, or at least good enough, has come to look like. It's time, I think, that we reset the bar. So thanks very much. We're going to dive in, I think.
Great. Well, thank you, Rick, for that wonderful lightning overview with your quick takeaways. And Julie, so of course the first word goes to you. You've been with Walmart for about 15 years now, not the full history Rick's book covers, certainly, but a significant period of time, and you've seen a lot of the transformations he's talking about and sort of what they've accomplished. And so I just wanted you to sort of share a little bit about, also what kind of drew you to Walmart and to working there, and what sort of stands out to you from sort of the changes that Walmart's undergone in recent years.
Sure. First, thank you for having me. It's good to kind of be back together. We've had these conversations over years, but haven't been able to be together in a while. I think a lot about what I came to Walmart for. It was not the expected career. My background is all in nonprofit, and I really thought that's where my career would be. But the transformation Rick talked about is really what drew me. I honestly came and interviewed as a practice interview. I was finishing grad school. I was invited to interview. My brother lived nearby, and I was going to come see him, interview, and then go get a job I really wanted. And that was the narrative. But over a period of conversations with business leaders primarily, I was interviewing for a job in the foundation, which is where I've been the 15 years, but I was starting to see the inklings of this thinking Rick talks about. 2 years before, the company had made a commitment to sustainability, and there were 3 parts to it: to be 100% renewable, zero waste, and to sell items so that people didn't have to choose between affordable and sustainable. That all feels very commonplace now. But in 2008, it was not, and it kind of blew me away. For somebody who had been thinking about how to build change in the world and had been thinking about that through a nonprofit sector, to meet business leaders, not fellow foundation colleagues, saying we can solve these problems through our core business, and not only do that, but do it in a way that will strengthen the business. It won't be a side project, it'll be a core business strategy, was really compelling and challenged thinking I'd grown up with and had. And so it was kind of a nice in to say, I'm gonna work in the foundation, but I'm gonna also have exposure and be at these business tables, thinking about how we use all of our assets to solve problems. And that spirit's only grown. That's what's kept me there, is certainly it started in sustainability, but the opportunity agenda that Rick writes about, that started in 2014, really started with the question, what would it mean to come to this different space and bring what we've been doing in sustainability there? Could we create a corporate movement similar to what we see in sustainability working on these issues?
Yeah, great, thank you. Thank you. Byron, I want to kind of pull you in here. You've worked with a bunch of different companies throughout your career, through your time at Opportunity at Work. And so I was thinking you could just share a little bit about what you see in terms of the business practice opportunity in general, and what are the issues that are sort of coming up for you that you kind of want to get out on the table here for us?
Yeah. Well, I think as a starting point, it's worth mentioning, because I work a lot across business, nonprofit, government, et cetera, and there's not a great understanding of the different sectors within a given sector. So for example, say, what should business do? I mean, business is an incredibly diverse, right, set of players. I mean, of course, there's small businesses and there's kind of like, and big businesses, but even within big businesses, the economics of a Walmart versus the economics of a Google versus a bank and so forth, they play very different roles. If you look at the workforce, for example, there's a lot of roles in Walmart that many other businesses don't have those roles because they outsource those roles. People are still doing those roles, and so there's a lot of factors that I think are worth looking at, and so I guess the way I see it is, to Rick's point, it's very important to have clear laws and that those laws be enforced. And part of the challenge is there's been an evisceration of the ability of government to actually, implement the laws that are already on the books and the enforcement. And I do think that's very important to say. But then it's really important that those be clear and predictable, and that businesses can have a basis of competition to innovate and create new demand and so forth, because that's actually where better jobs come from. The single most important thing I think we can do to raise wages, it's not the only thing, but it's an incredibly important thing, is that there be growth, that there be new markets that businesses are competing for, and they're hiring up people to go after them. And by the way, that they're not so insulated from competition that they think, well, we don't even have to do it, right? Like, I mean, it's really, really important, because the labor market is a bilateral market. The labor market isn't just for businesses to like pick and choose. They're like, oh, I'll take one of these, one of these. No, it's for people, right, to find their path, not just to earnings, but to learning and all the rest of it. And I just think we just have a starting point problem with the way we think about the job market. I think in many kinds of rooms sort of like this, there's an assumption that people are problems to solve, like, but actually people are problem solvers. And I think there's a lot more that can be unlocked on the business side. And I mean, I'll say a little bit more about what I think Walmart might be able to do more than it's doing, but I would start there. If you start with people, thinking about people as, as talent, as assets, as gifted, as skilled, which they are, you get to very different answers than if you start in a different place.
Yeah,
Maureen, can I jump in at
Well,
one thing?
sure.
So I completely agree, Byron, with you that obviously businesses need growth and the economy needs to grow. If everyone's going to be lifted up, there's no doubt about that. But I think we should also recognize the economy has grown immensely since, say, the 1970s, right? And what's changed is the way the pie is carved up, and that workers and frontline workers are not getting the share, right, of that economic growth that has happened, or productivity growth, any way you want to cut it. They are not getting the share that they did. So something else has fundamentally shifted, right? It's not like, oh, if only we had growth, this could sort out. And we have to persuade business that growth will come if they do these things. We've had growth, and the problem's gotten worse and worse. And so what I suggest is that something that has changed, and Maureen, you and I were talking about this, is culture, our larger culture, corporate culture, our norms, our expectations. And I think, that's not all of it, but that's also got to change. Sort of, we shouldn't have to work so hard to persuade business why this should happen. This is how the world used to be, more of, and I think we got to get back to some of that sharing of prosperity.
Yeah, I think, well, I just wanted to say what I appreciated about what you had to say is sort of the way you sort of framed the starting point of our labor market being, I think, too flat, right? And the other thing we were talking about, it's kind of like dehumanizing people, right? Sort of thinking of people as widgets rather than people as people.
And the only thing I want to say is I don't think it is so much a matter of persuading business. It is more a matter of structure. So in other words, I don't think it's about saying, it's nice to be nice to the nice. I think it's about having like a market structure that's competitive enough, for example, that you have to invest and hire people in order to go after new opportunities, that you can't just sort of stand pat. So it's more structure, and I think it has a lot to do with policy, but it's not just to do with wage policy. And I think, but from the standpoint of setting the floor, I do think that's government. Like I think if you're not having government set the floor, and so that everyone has to compete on that basis, then I don't think business will get there by itself.
Yeah, so I did tell them ahead of time they didn't actually have to answer the questions I asked them. So apparently they took me at my word there. Anyway, but I did want to say that I did appreciate how you framed that, but also on this question of growth. And I would ask, and this is going to kind of transition me to my next question about defining our terms. I think one of the problems is that we do have good measures for growth, but we have fewer measures for sort of human well-being and that kind of thing. And I think part of the issue is, so I sort of defined at the opening what we think of as good jobs. And if you want to read more on that definition, ASP WPN.slash-good jobs. You can find it. But we spent some time really sort of defining, because I think a lot of people talk about good jobs, but we don't really establish sort of what does that mean and how do we sort of see whether we're really meeting it. And so, Rick, I'm going to come to you to maybe reflect a little bit more on sort of what you saw with Walmart, but unpack a little bit. What do we mean by socially conscious capitalism? Like, how would you sort of impute that from what you were talking about with Walmart?
I think different companies talk about it in different ways, right? Walmart often refers to this concept of shared value, right? Of doing things that are good for the business that also are good for society. This concept that comes from Michael Porter and Mark Kramer, kind of their framework. Others obviously talk about stakeholder capitalism and the Business Roundtable, right? Now already back to 2019, sort of with nearly 200 CEOs at that time, I think it's over that now, who signed this statement to not specifically endorse, which their previous kind of purpose of a corporation statement did, said that the interests of all stakeholders were derivative of the interests of shareholders. That was their term, derivative of, and now they say, no, it should be, business, the purpose of business is to create value for all stakeholders. So I think, there are different definitions that all sort of run around the same thing. I think, in general, my sense, and having been at this for quite a while now, is that some of it's real, and there's been progress. Even having the conversation is an incredible change over, 15 years ago. Some of us are old enough to remember, right? When greed is good was the kind of, right, watchword of business. And I don't think you'd find CEOs saying that today. And I think words are important, and I think the whole movement has been important. I would say that the rhetoric has greatly outpaced reality from what I can see. And I'd say particularly on, if you think of it in ESG context, on the S part, on the social, on the human, the worker part. I think the environmental leg of it has moved faster. Companies, at least like Walmart, have been at it longer and have made real progress. Again, we're still the climate change numbers are not running in the right direction either, but I think there's been more progress there. I think that we can talk about why if you want, but I think they've been slower to move on the kind of worker well-being, job quality front.
Yeah, great, thank you. So Julie, I'm going to come to you next because, a part of the work you do with Walmart is around sort of strengthening communities as well. And I know that you, in the work of the philanthropy in particular, but at Walmart in general, you've thought a lot about what does equity mean in terms of our workplace, as well as sort of in the work that you support. So I'm wondering if you have sort of how you think about that, and maybe even if you have to my question of sort of like how do we define things in ways that we can sort of track and see if we're making progress, if you have sort of a framework and way of thinking about equity that has been useful in the work you do.
It's a hard question.
Yeah.
You started with community, and anytime somebody starts with community, I immediately, it's such a visceral word, I go back to where I grew up, which is a small town in Southwest Arkansas. And this work happened to have come alive in that town. When we started the work on the opportunity agenda, it wasn't long after I got a call from my dad, who's a rural physician in the area, and he said, I need you to explain what Walmart Academy is. And I was like, we don't really talk about work, so I'm like, why is my dad calling me about this? And he was like, a patient today, I spent 10 minutes looking at pictures of her graduation from Walmart Academy. And she was talking about how she'd never graduated and her whole family came, and she was now enrolling in her GED and community college, and really it was, what it is we've built 200 learning facilities, several of you I think have been to them, around the country, where it's a combination of on-the-floor learning and digital learning and a number of things that you can get up to 22 college credits in it. But it takes a workforce and really upskills it and invests. And that has impact on community. All of this happens in real place. And the story that my dad was kind of unpacking with me felt so emblematic of at least the philosophy that Walmart tries to do, which is we want to be an access employer. People like this woman who he was talking to didn't have a college degree, got a first job. There are a lot of diversity of jobs at a Walmart. So auto center, pharmacy tech, optical, truck driver, which starts at $110,000 a year. So come, get exposed to a broad set of careers, think about what it is, and increasingly what we've invested in is the upskilling and training to get there. A lot of that is on the job, but also if you want to attend Live Better U, which has 2 4-year degrees, short-term credentials, it's 100% paid for. And so how do we create this pathway for people, particularly people who may not have had success in traditional education, and make that very real so that that story is not an anecdote, but rather pretty normative. 80% of our jobs beyond the front line are filled internally, which I think is an important cultural piece. We were talking about culture, really recognizing the talent that is internal and seeing that as your first place to turn when you have promotions. That's been in the history of the company, but gotten stronger. 75% of store managers started as hourly associates. So it's really, on my team, in the home office, it's common. It's a badge of honor to work in the stores and to have worked your way up. And so how we do that in a way that is equitable and really, really inclusive, which we're working on, and we're really proud of the progress we're making, and build stronger communities.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Byron, I want you to probably build on that a little bit. I think that's a good segue into sort of a lot of the things that you think about in terms of this skills, and particularly skills built on the job, and how do you think about that with respect to job quality, but also sort of this challenge of economic mobility, right? So, and how we should think about it. I think, there is sort of a way of thinking about it within a firm, but then if we look at sort of within our sort of labor markets overall, it's really not that high. And so, so I'm just wondering if you could sort of comment on sort of business practices and sort of what you're seeing and what you're working on, and how that relates to addressing this challenge of economic mobility.
Well, first to the problem of economic mobility writ large in the United States. Rick talked about productivity, and of course productivity has been rising, and wages haven't been rising in tandem with them for median workers. So there's this big divergence between how much economic value, if you will, workers are generating and how much they are being paid. I mean, there is a wedge, and some of that is sort of the rising cost of healthcare, which creates a wedge, but some of that is very clearly there's a different sort of cut of the pie, and more of it is going to profits, and actually more of it is going to rents and housing. Like the cost of housing is almost as big a factor in this wedge as our rising corporate profits, and people don't always recognize that. So those are the kind of big macro contours. And then in the sense of how people move through the market, Opportunity at Work is particularly focused on 70 million Americans who are very much working all the time. They are skilled through alternative routes. They're stars. They don't have bachelor's degrees. They absolutely have skills, and very valuable skills that are undervalued in the market. And just to give you a sense of it, it's been true for as long as we've had statistics that someone with a college degree would make more as a starting salary than someone without. But for the first time in our history, it takes 30 years for a star to work and reach the level of the starting salary of a median college graduate. 30 years. And no one can tell me that 30 years of work experience is less valuable than a college degree. That can't possibly be true. It's absolutely not true. But that is a big element of this wage compression, and it relates to somewhere along the line, we decided that if you didn't have a college degree, sort of like, well, we're not going to really think about you as talent, right? It's more like in commodity work, and that's not limited to any one company. That is a very economy-wide problem, and that's a lot of what we're working on. And part of it, I mean, we think every company should be removing those degree requirements for things, for the kind of career path jobs, and we could show you that 30 million stars already have skills for jobs that pay 50% more than the ones they're in. So so far, doing that is a win-win for business. But I think to take it beyond that, because of course that wouldn't get us to a solution, at the level that you're talking about, Rick, I think it's really important to understand what business can do well and what government can do well, because they really are different. So government is particularly well suited when you think everybody should get something, or everybody in a subcategory should get something, or pay something, right? Like, it's good at saying, this is the way it works, period. So if you want to set a floor, like, that's why a minimum wage. So if you say to businesses are much less well suited for everybody gets something, because of course there's no business that employs everybody and they all look sort of a little different, whereas business is much better at, hey, you're trying to get, like, systematically you have a goal. You're trying to get more of something or less of something in the most kind of cost-effective way. That's what business does. So I think the big difference on sustainability versus the social part is the key moment was when you started to measure, right? You started to measure, carbon emissions abated, and then you saw what Walmart did, because Walmart is a very operational company, extremely operational and extremely scaled. And so when they could have a target and work not only within their company, but in their whole supply chain to say, no, we're going to reduce emissions, that's our goal. And what you have something, Project Gigaton, right? Yep. Trying to remove a gigaton of carbon emissions based on your supply chain. Yep. Well, there's never been something like that for income, right? For income and wage growth and economic opportunity, and there needs to be, and there could be. Because in fact, if you want to say what would be the measurable social value of business above and beyond making profits, one of the biggest things is actually developing people's skills, like building it in the way that they could, because we all learn most on the job, and so that they can actually earn more. And if Walmart did that not only within its business, which it's done a lot of, but what's the Project Gigaton equivalent in your supply chain, right? Like, why couldn't, with all the suppliers you have, why couldn't you set the norms, right, of kind of inclusive hiring, skills-based hiring, and actually shape the whole market, which, by the way, would also take care of the problem. If you set that standard that it includes your suppliers, well, that should include people's outsourcers. So businesses should be doing this. I think a lot of businesses who have mainly high-wage workers, right, so they look good in that dimension, but they have a lot of low-wage workers working on their campuses, working in their businesses. They're just outsourced. You should be able to set that standard there too. So I think that is something that you could do, Walmart could do, I think would be in Walmart's competitive interest broadly. But at the end of the day, if you want to make sure everyone gets a standard, I really do think it has to be rules. It has to be kind of government.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I think, Julie, the first thing that we had a conversation around was a paper that I wrote that was called, Raise the Floor and Build Ladders, right? Yeah. So really about, like, how do we have a set of standards that sort of form this floor? And I think one of the points that we were talking about is that by having a basic standard that's sufficient for everybody, that it makes it much more possible for people to climb those ladders, right? So that those things are really complementary strategies, not either or strategies. And I'm going to now ask you about complementary strategies that you're working on, because you talked about how, sort of both with the business but also your role in philanthropy, like you have this opportunity to kind of think about those strategies, how they complement each other. And I was just wondering if you could sort of talk about that, like how you partner with the social sector on certain things and sort of where that works well, and whether you see any also sort of where there might be frictions in that kind of work.
Sure. I think a lot of what we're talking about here is systems level change. And no one actor does that. It really is done in all sectors working together, lots of actors working together. As Byron talked about, there is how do we work with our suppliers, how do we work, the work he's talking about of building a skills-based system we're doing as part of the Business Roundtable with a number of companies to try to set that standard. But it also makes me think about meeting Rick. You're talking about our first conversation about your article. You also brought together a group of us, it was probably 7 or 8 years ago, to talk about these issues. And Rick was presenting about a case study about American Airlines, who had invested in wages, and their stock price dropped dramatically. And I came up and I said, hey, that feels real familiar. That just happened at Walmart. When we came and talked about our investment in this transformation we're about to go through, and that word was used very intentionally because We didn't think we could just raise wages. We needed to change lots of things. It's all very complicated to get it working in a way that's super productive. The market also did not respond positively. And so this really is a system we have to think about, how we approach it. And several of the words kind of Rick defined in his conversation about conscientious capitalism are how we think about it. So it is a long-term view on the health of the company. And it is believing that shared value that solves social and environmental problems that are relevant to the business and create business value in the long term will build a stronger company. And the depth which with that is felt at Walmart is very real. It's then also believing that we can do this while investing in multiple stakeholders, that we can invest in associate wages, associate growth, all of these things. We can invest in price for customers, things like keeping inflation, we just announced the Easter meal will be the same cost as last year. So those kinds of things that are very real to consumers, and shareholders can get a meaningful return. And that takes a lot of thoughtful work to make it happen. And it's really how the business works, and we lead and feel like that's the biggest model for change. But it can't solve everything. And there are market failures. There are just issues that aren't suited to it yet. And that's where we bring in our philanthropy, is to say, given we sit in the business and think about this, what are we seeing that the business just can't quite figure out yet? And what are the societal ways we can invest in NGOs and thought leaders to really get at the root cause of that so that over time the market will work that way? And how do we engage others in that? Coalitions, other businesses, NGOs, our list of partners is probably thousands long. It's hard to even comprehend. But that is how we think about change. It doesn't solve it all. We're absolutely on a journey. These problems are hard. But I think it's a way to think about change, and increasingly companies are coming and saying, how do you do that, and how might we think about it that way too?
Yeah, great, thank you. And I love that sort of investing in thought leaders who are trying to think about ways that markets can work differently. So Byron, I come to you, trying to rewire the labor market. So, I think this issue of sort of systems level thinking, and I think this is one of the things that's always sort of, how do we match up sort of the system level thinking that we're trying to get to with sort of what are individual actors within that system doing? And I was wondering if you could sort of comment on it from this perspective of what businesses are doing, what you see as opportunities, and I think you and I have both had this experience with businesses where it's sort of like you were saying, how they, 30 years of lived experience doesn't earn, and you're trying to sort of point out to them, like, this is a value to them, it should be a value to keep them, it should be a value to you reduce your turnover, or improve your vacancy rates, et cetera. It's just not matching up in those systems that they use. So I was wondering if you could comment on sort of what do you see as sort of like some of the opportunities, but what are some of the frictions also that, the challenges that keep businesses from sort of doing the things we're trying to sort of make markets work for them to do?
Right. Well, if you think about systems change, you can see, like, you're in your current state is a certain type of equilibrium, which is to say, if one business changes everything it does and nobody else changes anything, that business's initiatives might not be successful, whereas if multiple things change, right, like they might very well be very successful. So the question is both, where are you trying to get to, but also, how do you get there? And so, look, I think we're, for us at Opportunity at Work, we want to get to a world where if you can do the job, you can get the job. And we don't say half the people are talent, the other half are, right, something other than that. And where if you actually learn something valuable and contribute, you actually get paid more, right? You actually can earn more based on that learning on the job. And finally, that if a pathway that got you there and whatever supports got you there is successful, there should be resources flowing behind that so others can do it too. And that's something we haven't talked about much. It doesn't really happen. Like you could do a great job, and that, in the nonprofit sector, that doesn't really get you anything in terms of additional resources. It's just like, okay, great, pat on the back. And so, so I think those are, and fundamentally, I agree with you that it's the conversation here, that having a higher floor where people were not at risk of falling off the edge every minute of every day would make it much easier for people to invest in themselves, to be more entrepreneurial. We know this, and we saw it during COVID too, when you had like some public support for people, how much they were able to sort of move in different directions. So we've seen it with our own eyes that it could make a difference, and so I think that's really important to note. We've also seen, by the way, with our own eyes, essential workers, frontline workers, not just heroic, but extremely skilled in reconfiguring supply chain, safety protocols, all of that, all of the things that businesses say they want. We saw that in frontline workers that they're not taking seriously in these pathways. So all of that is true, but I think when we say at Opportunity Work, we focus, like remove the degree requirements, for example, build these pathways, have an alternative route strategy, that's not the totality of the change, but that is something that businesses could do now and actually benefit immediately. And if you had multiple businesses doing it, you could create a different market dynamic with more pull, more alternatives for people. But ultimately then, to get the full picture, Rick wants, you do absolutely have to have public policy, and I would say coordinating institutions. Every place in the world that has done a decent job of this, a lot of them in Northern Europe, I think Australia has done a pretty good job. They have institutions that are very market responsive, but they're not profit maximizing, right? It's very important that, because profit maximizing means you skim, right? It's like even if the return on training someone is the same as poaching them, the cost of poaching is less, right? So you get these collective action problems. On the minimum wage, for example, Australia has an independent commission that sets the minimum wage, and it goes up, and businesses and different industries and the government and everybody puts in their thoughts on it, unions, and they make these decisions, and it's very transparent and it's predictable. So in other words, and it's countrywide. So businesses can adapt to different rules if it's predictable and it's gradual. So right now at current exchange rates, the Australian minimum wage is a little bit under $15 an hour, but it goes up in ways that businesses can adjust to. And so Australian businesses have to raise their productivity as they go, and it's gradual. Anyway, so that's an example of the kind of institution that could make a massive difference. But you can't, in such a complex economy, you can't set aside the value of a market, but you need to have workers as customers of the labor market, not as just commodities in the labor market. That's the key.
Yeah, thank you. So, and I think that's going to get me to Rick in a question, but I want to sort of alert people that I'm going to come to the audience for questions soon. So, be ready. So Rick, I think this is really interesting, this idea of sort of the institutions and systems. But one of the institutions that I think, we sort of struggle with is our financial markets, right? And particularly this sort of shareholder pressure but also I think maybe a little bit the way that sort of the narratives of the financial market sort of dominate our thinking a little bit. And I was just wondering if you wanted to comment a little bit on these kinds of sort of shareholder pressures that Walmart and other companies face, and how you think about sort of the way that intersects with the challenges of improving conditions and pay for workers. How has that limited progress from your perspective?
Look, I think shareholder primacy still reigns despite moves toward a stakeholder orientation by many businesses. I think it's just the facts. And I happen to know the numbers from Walmart. I don't think they're unique. So the time period I looked at when the company began to raise wages in 2015, through the end of 2021 when I kind of stopped my reporting, and again, there's been another raise since, the investment was $5 to $6 billion in their workers. A lot in higher pay, also in training, improved benefits. They've moved much more, to their credit, to full-time workers from part-time workers. So lots of progress, lots of good things. $5 to $6 billion is real money, obviously. That's a lot of money. Over that same period, the company bought back $43 billion worth of their stock, right? And look, I haven't talked to Julie directly about this. I've heard from some of her colleagues who say, I'm way oversimplifying things if you think you can just take, money for share buybacks and apply it to workers. and I'm not a finance guy, maybe I'm oversimplifying things. I tend to think they're overcomplicating things, that money is fungible at some point, and again, this is a company with a lot of, free cash flow. And again, I'm not picking on them. This is a broader problem. It's interesting listening. On some level, look, first of all, I completely agree. It's complicated, and there are many moving parts. And again, the work that Byron is doing in terms of moving to recognizing skills over credentials is so important, and a really important part of this multifaceted solution. I run a company, Bendable Labs, that is a lifelong learning and workforce development, company. Our product is a digital platform in those areas, and so I completely agree that if you learn new things or if you have skills, you should be recognized for them. But again, as a society, we can't make it so that it's your next job. That if you only got to that next one, you learned something new and you got to the next one, or if you showed the skills and you got to the next one, then you'll be okay. And this is the raise the floor part of it. And I think, again, companies have, again, by and large, across corporate America, are over-indexed on the training and education side now, right? And under-investing in the raise the floor side.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would make that. So I have more questions, but we're limited in our time, and I really do want to come to the audience, and also if there's any folks online, again, encourage them to ask questions. And the last thing I want to mention is that keep your hands up. I'm going to take a bunch of you at once, I see. So is that we will be having a book signing after this for those of you in the room, so please don't rush away. Okay, so I am going to go Mark, Molly, the gentleman in the front. I'll take this side, and then I'll come to this side. So.
Hi. Julie, good to see you again. Good to see all of you. Mark Popovich, retired from EOP. A nerd question, because I know you're a nerd, and it's around metrics, measures, and benchmarks related to all of this issue. Because I know you guys, as a corporation, are very precise in knowing company-wide, division, line of business, store, even down to the shelf level, how things are performing or not performing. So I suspect that what you did in sustainability, which was metric-driven, has been driven here, and I know some of those metrics. But I was just going to ask you two questions. The second one's in two parts.
Nerd to nerd.
Oh, wait, you already quit. Damn it.
Don't listen to her. So have you learned something about what to measure and what to benchmark as a corporation that you'd like to share with us? And then, how does this resonate, or that example, how did that resonate within the corporate and board leadership? And then lastly, does that have to connect to making the case within Walmart to improve job quality for associates, or how independent is that decision from that kind of information? Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to hold that question. I like to take three at once. And
I'll remember it all.
Okay, good.
Subpart B.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Molly Kinder. I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution. And I just wanted to first say I've absolutely loved this event. I found it so refreshing. Julie, it's wonderful to have you in the room. I really admired your philanthropy over the years, but it's just great that you're here for this discussion, and I want to commend you for that. Rick's book, if you haven't read it, is fantastic. I read it so quickly because I loved it so much. Rick knows I think it's fabulous work, but it's important work. It's really thorough. I think it's very fair. But Rick is very brave in the book, and this is what I want to surface in my question. It's really rare in our sort of public thinker world of think tanks and scholars talking about job quality or economic opportunity to actually spell out when a company doesn't meet the bar. And Maureen's work was fantastic with partners defining what job quality is. And part of that definition is a family sustaining or a living wage. That's very easy to measure. There's a lot of measures out there. And Rick has pointed out in his book that Walmart, like many other retail companies, on average, doesn't meet the bar for job quality. And I think there's incredible value in saying that, and also pulling in the context that it's not Walmart alone. It's the incentives, it's the short-term nature of capitalism, it's the lack of of regulations, but it's important that it's said. It's not just that we talk in platitudes or generalities that we have a low wage crisis, but it was said that the biggest employer in the country is not meeting the bar that Maureen has pointed out. And my question is, I've as someone who comes from the think tank world, Rick talks in his introduction about the fact that a lot of us receive funding from corporations. And so my question is, should there be more of an explicit conversation between wonderful philanthropists like yourself, Julie, and those of us who pursue this funding to say, how can we take this funding and do amazing work, but stay open to saying the things that have to be said? And shouldn't we make that more explicit? Shouldn't we talk about that and say, when we take this money, I don't think Julie's trying to silence us, but maybe without thinking about it, we do. So I love this panel, and I want to see more of this in Washington. And so I'm wondering if there's a conversation that needs to be had about how we do more of this.
Okay, great. So one last one before we go to Merritt. This right here.
Hi, my name is Mike Golash. It seems like you're sort of leaving the working people out of this equation. You're saying these corporations, these NGOs, you relatively well-off people, should decide how that workers, what share of the social wealth that's created they should get. And I think, historically, that doesn't work out too well for people at the bottom. The rich get richer and the poor stay relatively poor. So the whole idea historically was that we have a labor movement to sort of try and set a standard of wages and benefits for workers, and that's been under attack for the last 40 or 50 years. And Walmart, Starbucks, Amazon are leading that attack, and there's no indication that they're willing to back off from that. So I don't see a future of greater equality based on what they decide to do. I see them continue to make more profits, and I consider to be a lot of poor workers.
Okay, great. So we have questions on metrics and measures. We have questions on sort of this corporate philanthropy and how we communicate about these issues, and we have questions about the labor movement. So you probably all have thoughts on all of these. Julie, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm
Okay.
happy to. So I'll start with Mark's question. I think it's a complicated question, and it's one you've done a lot of work on. We've learned from you and others. And why it's complicated and a little bit different than sustainability is sustainability tends to be very logical. You do this, it reduces GHG. And it tends to be a kind of one-to-one measure. The labor market doesn't work that way. I think Zainab Tan's work is really influential on how I think about this. It's all rewired. And you got to cross-train, and you got to redesign the operations, and all of these things to make it all work. And the labor market is dynamic, and it's changing things in the process. And so that kind of, you re-laid out how you load a truck, and therefore you drove fewer miles, is not so simple in the labor market. But that doesn't mean we don't need to be measuring things. It just means we need to be cautious of saying, because we did this, this happened. Because normally it's 17 things you did that drove that outcome. And so things we look at are turnover rates, time to promotion, which is right now 7 months on average, the ability to fill roles, and really how many people are able to be hired from internal, how fast we're able to innovate, whether we're getting good ideas from associates and they're part of the solution. It's a broad range of metrics that we're thinking about, because the diversity of the labor force is there too. We have people who are intentionally part-time. As Rick said, our workforce is now over 70% full-time, but they're pretty young. That's, when you have a workforce from 16 to 99, or maybe even broader, what I want, what you want, what is all different. And so those metrics that matter for each person are different. So that's an insufficient but starting answer for you. And I think when you asked about how we talk about it, I think internally people understand that. And so anybody who comes in and says, I am going to do this and therefore this will happen, there's skepticism. But I'm going to do these 4 things, and I think together they'll do this, I think starts to be heard in thoughtful ways. And And then it's how are we going to iterate to make sure we get that outcome, because we may not have gotten it right just in our first look. Coming to Molly, I mean, I think this is something literally my team spends a lot of time talking about. We talk a lot about how we both work with people we disagree with, we fund projects, we make sure that the power dynamics are as minimal as possible, which is really hard in funders. And I think hopefully all the people on the panel can attest who have been funded by us to say, we've had tough conversations. I happen to work at a company that embraces that and that says, I've been asked in evaluations at my annual evaluation, how many critics did you listen to this? How much time did you spend listening to divergent voices? That's rare. I don't think many of my fellow funders are encouraged to do that. So it really matters the culture of the funder you're working with. It's also part of why I stay at Walmart is that I'm not pressured to make our grantees kind of fall in line, but rather be part of a place where we're working on a system where we want the same outcome, but we may agree on what we're funding, but not other pieces.
Okay, great. Other
Yeah,
comments
can
on
I-
this or on the labor movement question, which I think probably
yeah,
is a
I'll
place
speak
where
to that too.
we might have
I'll
several different
pick up
opinions.
that, but first, just on measurement. Just one note. I think it's really important. I think there's another place we need more rules. I think we need more rules mandating that companies are transparent about job quality. And I think it's really hard for people to figure out, is this a decent employer to go work for? Is this a good frontline job? You can look on Glassdoor, you can look on PayScale, there's some crowdsourcing things. But in terms of a consistent, clear, relatively simple way that companies are required to report on what people make, what their benefits are like, how safe is it, what's equity look like within the company, what are the opportunities for advancement, just some basic stuff. It's a black box. And I can tell you it's really hard to move the needle. I spent 2 years working with the state controller in California on a bill to try and get employers in California with 1,000 or more California employees to have to disclose a real basic set of information like that. The whole idea was it was supposed to look like a nutrition label of job quality at a company. So these would only be big employers. We were shot down by the California Chamber of Commerce. We were on their job killer list for 2 years. I don't know how disclosing information about job quality kills jobs. The only thing they said too was that it would be a great administrative burden, and I thought, well, then we're creating jobs, so now I'm really so anyway, a lot of resistance, and I think we need a lot more transparency in that area. Last thing I'll say is I couldn't agree more. We need to pass the PRO Act. We need, hopefully, this fast food bill in California will survive the attacks from industry, and some kind of sectoral bargaining can emerge as well. I think there are opportunities to bring companies in like Walmart that have resisted unionization, very hard over a long time with sectoral bargaining. I think that's a real opportunity to bring them to the table. So I couldn't agree more. That's a huge, huge important part of the solution. And if you read Matthew Desmond's new book, Poverty by America, it is points to the decline in unionization as a huge factor in the problems we're seeing.
Yeah, very quickly, I'm quoted several times in Rick's book, having hard conversations on topics like minimum wage and so forth. And one of those conversations was with Julie a while ago. And before Walmart had really leaned into raising minimum wage, I sort of said, what you're doing on training and what you're thinking about doing is really good, but no one's going to listen to you until you start raising minimum wage, and in my view, kind of advocate for it, because frankly, nobody cares what you say until they see what you do. So, so there's that. On measurement, I will say, measurement of, there's been much more damage from measurement of people by companies, and it relates to your point, sir, like top-down measurement. It captures very poorly, and initially it captured mainly people as cost, and not anything about them as value, far less anything about them as sort of creating long-term value. And so the measurement is part of the damage, frankly, that's been done by having only short-term measures, only cost-side measures, and people's value has been massively underestimated to the detriment of people, certainly, but to the detriment of business and industry and the talent pool and all the rest of it that we're now trying to undo, right? It's kind of like if you offshore all your entry-level jobs, for example, you really shouldn't be surprised when there's no like experienced workers in 5 years because they're right. I mean, so it's just, so I actually think it's not that measurement doesn't matter. And I said earlier that if the business can't measure something, it's definitely not going to do it for real. But we need far better measures, different measures that are really more holistic. And then on the point of unions, I do think that's a very important point. And if you look internationally, the idea that a strong union movement is inconsistent with economic growth and company dynamism, I mean, it's not true, right? I mean, but it's the question of how the sectors work together. I mean, even in the United States, in the sectors that have high union density, like the trades, for example, in construction, I mean, unions play a critical role, right, in sort of the whole apprenticeship network and so forth. They're an example, in a way, of private sector unions being very market sensitive but not profit maximizing. And then I think there is something, we haven't talked a lot about power in this conversation. An economist, sorry, I apologize, like think about power a lot in terms of opportunity cost. So for me, it is, and I think this is very true, when there's a lot of demand, when frontline workers have a lot of options, it does matter, right? It does put wages up. It does push wages up. But the union movement matters because it's, aggregations of power matter. And one thing I will say about the union movement, it's quite striking, and economists would not predict it. The union movement in this country has historically been a very important part of coalition to, say, increase benefits for everyone, whether you're in a union or not, right? If you were totally self-interested, you would kind of say, hey, that's a reason to join a union. But, it's sort of like, there's so many things. So I do think it's very important. It's also complicated. How do we get from where we are now, right, in the private sector, I mean, union density is so low and it's very kind of sector specific. I don't think it makes sense to depend on that strategy as a single strategy for raising wages and the like. But I think there's a lot of evidence that it can be constructive. How we get from here to there is a different question.
Yeah, and just to add quickly on that union point, I do think yes, we're at a historic sort of like high in terms of the popularity of unions among people, and polling would sort of say lots of people want a union, and sort of at a historic low in terms of coverage of union representation. We actually are doing some work because back to not maligning economists, I mentioned I'm married to one. I actually started a PhD in economics myself, whatever, I have an MBA. And what I will say from all of my various economics training over the years is that business leaders are really trained to have a lot of antipathy towards unions, right? Like this is the business culture that we've built. And so one of the things that we're doing within the Economics Opportunities Program is trying to have sort of off the record, quiet conversations with business leaders who are interested in sort of just basically learning more about unions and how they operate and how to think about them, and try to think about, can we sort of start building a little bit more kind of constructive culture around sort of, how we sort of talk with maybe an organized workforce, whether it's organized capital L labor, or what have you, but how to really think in maybe a little bit different way about that. So that's, a little bit of...
And our friend Roy Bahat at
Our
Berkeley
friend
Business
Roy
School
Bahat
is teaching a class to MBAs
yes,
on that subject as well, which is great.
Exactly. So,
important.
so anyway, so stay tuned, I guess. Right here, and then those will be our last two questions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Raj Boya, a DC resident. Thank you to the author for writing this book. This is a fantastic conversation. Hope there will be more conversations of this nature. I have two questions. One is, probably the author knows the wage gap between a CEO and the employee at the bottom of the ladder, how it was for roughly 3 decades after the Second World War, versus from 1980s onwards, the gap increased, right? So hypothetically speaking, if we were to go back to how it was from 1950s to maybe late 70s, how the situation would be. My other question is, corporations that do not take care of their employees well, it makes me wonder why they have a foundation. I would like to know what your take on that is, because it doesn't make sense to me at all. On one hand, you are not taking care of your employees. They're on food stamps. they're on Medicaid. That means the state is subsidizing. And on the other hand, you say you have a foundation for what purpose? Is it about publicity, campaign? I mean, I don't understand. I would like to know your take on that. Thank you.
Do you want Julie to take the second, and I'll take?
We'll take this question here, and then we'll.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Yep.
Thank you so much. My name is Pascal. I'm with the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. I want to bring this back to a values level for a moment. And per your view, what are the key guiding principles that form the moral imperative to spur the business case to transform the capital markets? So again, those key guiding principles, and I know that there's not one size fits all, but per your experiences, what are those transformations to create the laws and the rules that are necessary?
I can start with a couple
Julie,
of things.
I'm going to
if you
let
want.
you start with a couple of things, but also I want to say, like, throw in your final closing remarks.
Okay.
This is it.
So on the foundation question, I want to somewhat disagree with the premise. I've always struggled with this idea that like a workforce on benefits is a bad thing. We hire people who are on benefits. There are work requirements for benefits. And so getting that job, building skills, and moving off benefits is hopefully a role of the private sector. As a large employer with a big front line who hires people who are on benefits with work requirements, we have a large group. We're trying to move them off through work and growth. But the piece of the foundation is also really important for the reason we talked about. It's another tool to make change. And so how are we really investing in multiple ways? Just like stakeholder capitalism, it's not a one or, it's a all of the above. And then quickly on the principles question, Byron said something that I think is really important to underline. This like view of labor as an asset and a value creator versus a cost is really important. And it's cultural, it ties to unionization, it ties to lots of things. And so how you really lean in and build culture and principles that start with the idea the entire workforce creates value, has skills, and is worthy of investment versus cost. And even that frame of investment versus cost is really important.
Okay, Byron, I'm going to go to you next and let Rick have the last.
Okay, sure. So Rick will address the first question too, I assume. But on the question of values, I think the starting point is, markets are not golden orbs descended from heaven, right? Like markets are human institutions, government is human institutions. Everything we're talking about here is built by people in civilizations, and it's for people. Like markets are for people. People aren't for markets. Markets are for people. The purpose of a market, the purpose of it is to make, to allow people to flourish, right? I mean, and the labor market specifically, and again, economists are going to have to take the rap for this. Economists model the labor market as supply is people. We don't do that at Opportunity at Work, by the way. Our supply side is as talent developers and but economists say supply of labor is people and demand for labor is companies. And they model it such that, and this is inherent in like all our policy systems, is if nobody would work, nobody would want to do anything, create anything or whatever if they weren't paid to do it. It's leisure preference is the nice like technical term. It's ridiculous because all the psychological evidence, we have massive amounts of evidence that long periods of unemployment are devastating, right, for people's kind of self-concept, the kind of learning, the community, the mastery, all of these things that are part of work, in addition, of course, to earning a living wage and all the rest of it. So in other words, you could just as easily model the demand side of the labor market as people and the supply side as companies and employers competing with offers to supply that to them. And whenever you see a tightness in the labor market, great resignation, you've heard that term recently, it starts to look like that. It starts to look like companies competing with offers for people. And for some people, it looks like that their whole careers, like the MBAs and all the rest of that. Well, it should look like that for more people, right? And I think if we thought about those institutions, government too, but I'm talking markets for a moment because you asked about it from a capitalism standpoint. It would be really great if our institutions reflected that. Even our accounting code, FASB accounting, treats machines and software as fundamentally more valuable than people. So that's why it's amplified through the tax code and all the rest of it, but it's really the accounting system that does that. You are more profitable if you solve the same problem, same cash in, same cash out. If you solve it with people, cross-trained, right, like all of that, you will look less profitable in FASB accounting than if you solve it with machines and software. It's literally an anti-people accounting code. That's how deep the systemic problems go. So I think if you really took the heuristic that said all of our institutions are for people and you reformed accordingly, we could get a long way. But part of that would have to move government, politics, out of this zero-sum thing where right now we're hurting other people, right? It's kind of like, that's a big part of it. We haven't talked much about it, but that's the fundamental principle. All of this is for people. People aren't fodder for any of this. People are meant to be the beneficiaries, and that's how we have to think about it and reform our systems.
Great, thank you. Rick?
Just a couple of last quick points. And we went from 25 to 1, something like that, in the mid 60s as CEO to worker pay, and we're at 300 whatever to 1 now, and in some cases it's way higher than that, over 1,000 to 1. I think it's a symptom of a bigger issue, which again is a symptom of why shareholder primacy is so hard to root out, right? We turn CEOs into key shareholders themselves, and most of their compensation is now based on stock, and so they're incentivized to look at the world in a lot of the ways that Byron was just talking about, and to be more short-term oriented in many cases, and to look at labor as a cost constantly, as opposed to something adding value over the long term. So again, all the incentives are wrong. I think the other thing that is done, though, it has created a distance that I don't think existed as much in the 60s or 70s. Leo Strine, who some of you may know, was the head judge in Delaware where a lot of business laws, litigated. He said to me, in the 60s, the CEO lived in the biggest house in town, but they didn't live like in a whole different world. And I think that there is a gap now. As much as good CEOs like the Walmart CEO, Doug, are out in the stores and talking to people, but it's hard to not have an empathy gap, a lived experience gap. When you make $25 million a year and your average worker is making $17.50 an hour, I think it's just really hard to relate, and I think that gap is actually part of the problem. It's created this social distance between the C-suite and the front lines. The last thing I'll say is, and maybe this goes to the moral question, I like to use that word because I think there's morality about this. There's just right and wrong. I've said this, many forums as I've talked about the book. I don't want to live in a society where people get up, go to work, and then have to make terrible trade-offs at the end of the month between paying their rent or buying medicine, being able to afford medicine, or putting enough food on the table for their kids. Again, even with this gap between, of lived experience, I don't think most people in the C-suite want to live in that world either. And I think, we've seen CEOs who've actually, when they've gone out and we need a TV show, right, to do this, Undercover Boss. But when real CEOs have gone out and actually gotten in touch with their frontline workers and done surveys and have learned, right, Dan Schulman at PayPal is a good example. I mean, they came to, from what I understand, is really kind of a genuine living wage sort of system, and gave huge, it made huge investments so that their employees could have affordable health care, gave them stock in the company, made everyone owners, did all this stuff. Why? Because he went out and surveyed and found out, oh my God, we have all these people on food stamps and Medicaid and struggling to get by, and didn't, somehow had missed that and was like, well, you were paying them whatever, $12 an hour. What did you think was happening? But once he did realize that, I think these are good people. And so I think there is a moral case to be made here. I don't think anybody wants to live in a society like that. And so I think actually an open, honest conversation about that can hopefully, go toward some of the solution.
Yeah, well, thank you both very much. Thank you, Rick, Julie, Byron. As you can see, this is why these are some of my favorite people to chat with. So I want to give you guys a huge round of applause.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
I also want to thank my colleagues, Colleen Cunningham, Amanda Finns, Matt Helmer, who's sitting back there, Tony Mastria, who is online somewhere, Merritt Steuven, Maxwell Johnson, Victoria Prince, Seaning Young. I have such amazing colleagues, and our Aspen AV team. We have amazing colleagues, and they do fabulous work. I'm going to give them a round of applause too. So thanks to everybody who joined us and on social media for tweeting about it. We're using the hashtag #TalkOpportunity. It's always great to hear what you think. Please do fill out our feedback survey. Thank you for joining us and sharing your questions. You can also send us an email at eop.program@aspeninstitute.org. Let us know what you think. Please join us for a little book signing after this. And thank you all so much for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Maureen.